Hello, I'm Paul Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to New Frontiers. Now, our panel today is going to have a great discussion about the issue of affordability. There's no doubt that that's becoming a bigger issue in politics today. The Republicans being routed in the last election, even Donald Trump seems to indicate that he recognizes the Republican Party needs to do a better job on affordability. In fact, we saw him lower tariffs on food just in the past week. Now, on the panel today, we're going to have a discussion about whether the Democratic agenda or the Republican agenda has any real chance of making our economy more affordable for the average working class in America. I can also tell you that I believe that both parties have been abandoning the forces of free markets and free enterprise, and those are the primary cause of what we're seeing not only in the inefficiencies in our economy, but more importantly, in products becoming less affordable. Now, that brings me to what we're doing with the Arizona Independent Party. For those of you who have been watching, you know that in Arizona, we formed a new party called the Arizona Independent Party. It has effectively taken over the No Labels Party, and we renamed it to give it more of a local presence. I believe it is of enormous consequence that we re-engage the independent voter, not just to the United States, but to the rest of the world. There's no doubt that we have an obligation to fight against the ideologues, the illiberal or dictatorial forces that seem to be at play inside of both political parties today. Both of them wanting us to live within an orthodoxy that is just an antithesis to what our founders actually talked about 250 years ago. But more importantly, it's antithetical to not only a free market and free enterprise, but to making certain that there's an upward mobility of people inside of our society, that people have the opportunity to improve their lot, and where we keep prices at more of an affordable level. Now, during the show, we'll talk about this, but I also want you to know that if you have any interest in running as a candidate in the Arizona Independent Party, we now have the ability to get you on the ballot, and we need good candidates who are willing to step forward and make a difference. If you like what it is that we're doing here on this show, push that subscribe button and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, let me start by welcoming our guests on New Frontiers. I don't even know if they're guests anymore. They've been on the show so long, they've got to at least be co-hosts. But I'm going to start with my favorite professor at ASU, Henry Thompson. I like to call him Lord Thompson. Just you'll notice when you hear the accent why that is. But today I don't know, Henry, have you been out at the school or you've been taking care of little Arthur back at home?
Good to see you, Paul. Yeah, I've been taking care of the boys. We went down to Tucson for the weekend, actually, to the Air and Space Museum. And I don't know if you've ever been there, Paul. I'm sure you have. They've got like amazing old planes. You can go up to B-29, a Blackbird reconnaissance plane, a lot of the planes that as a young kid I kind of dreamed of seeing. So we had a great time and the boys ran around and jumped in some of these model planes where they could get in and pretend they were flying. So we had a really good weekend actually down in Tucson.
That's awesome. I don't know if you've ever gone out to Luke, but I own some property out on the other side of Luke, right at the end of the runway, which wasn't so great for development, but nonetheless, if you listen to those planes taking off, it's just an amazing thing. I always call it the sound of freedom because that's what it is. But it's just the ground rumbles and roars, and I'll take my nephews and nieces and kids out to just watch it. They're totally stunned and amazed by it.
Well, that's great. Sign us up next time.
Yep. All right, Robb, big focus of our show today is going to be your last column, but nonetheless, are you in Phoenix today?
I am in Phoenix, so it's gotten too cold up north for me, so I'm comfortably ensconced here.
So I'm taking right at the end of Christmas, we do what's called Viking Christmas, which I always like to advertise, but we take we take the entire family up to our cabin in Munns Park, and we celebrate the new year through what we call Viking Christmas. Now, it's really kind of a ploy for me to be able to get all my grandkids and nephews and nieces all at once, and that I don't have to go to 25 different houses on Christmas morning. Instead, they all come to my place the weekend after. But we also talk about their heritage and where they came from, and we do snow graves where you dig graves, and all the dads have to get in the graves and they bury them, and the dad that can last longer in his shorts in the snow grave ends up being the winner, what you would call them. Any event. All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We are going to spend a significant amount of time talking about the last election and this whole affordability issue. But I don't think we can really do that unless we kind of set the stage in terms of where we are today on a couple of the big issues that happened this last week. And one of them was the government opened back up. Now, it was a record period of time, only surpassing the last government closing that happened during the Trump administration. It should be, I would think, a big win for Trump. Democrats are a little bit more divided on it, although I think if Democrats were to carefully look at it, they got some wins out of it as well. So let me start with getting your opinion on the opening up of government and how you see the result of that politically. And I'll start with you, Henry.
I think this is one of these issues that has actually had quite targeted effects in that there are a relatively small number of sectors where people have been really severely affected by this government shutdown. So I work at a big research university at Arizona State, and the university gets a lot of money from the federal government. Some of that money has stopped coming in because there haven't been people working in the federal government. People haven't been able to apply for new grants. They haven't been able to get feedback from their program officers who've been administering their grants. So it has a big effect on a big research university like ASU. Obviously, it has a big effect on people who work directly for the federal government or who work for the Park Service or the military and things. But apart from that, I think that basically this was another one of these issues that went down the partisan divide. The Democrats said that the Republicans had made demands, there would be a reduction in healthcare benefits, etc., and they had to stand firm. And Republicans said that the Democrats were refusing to fund the government and the whole thing was their fault. So I think that I'm not sure whether this really moved the needle apart from people who were directly affected and were probably pretty angry about it. And that could have been a major contributor to this victory of the Democrats in Virginia, where there are a lot of federal employees who may have been losing paychecks or at least had a lot of insecurity around their paychecks because of the government shutdown.
Bob, trying to figure out the winner on this one's kind of interesting to me. I think the Republican spin on why it is that they won is that Democrats basically conceded and ended up with nothing. On the other hand, I think on the Democratic side, had they really kept this going, I don't know that it was smart for them to close it down in the first place. I don't think it was. But had they kept it going, they'd have been shutting down traffic over the Thanksgiving holiday. That couldn't have been good for them. And in addition to it, they made their point, which is on the healthcare issue. They blame that on the Republicans, and so they were able to kind of play the blame game a little bit and push the ball in that direction. What's your thought on that? Is there any winner on that, or were both parties as well as the general public a loser on it?
Well, I think certainly both parties and the general public were losers, as they are always in a government shutdown. I believe that that's an irresponsible act, and I think that the blame for it can be shared in this case. Politically, I think the benefit to Democrats for standing up to Trump was beginning to be overcome by the adverse effects of the shutdown on a broader range of individuals, as Henry described. And I don't think that they came away empty-handed the way that it's being discussed. I think that it was a victory to get a restoration of the mass firings that the Trump administration had unleashed to try to create leverage on the Democrats. And the commitment, we'll see whether Trump honors it, but a commitment not to engage in any others until the expiration of this continuing resolution in late January. Additionally, I don't think the script has been fully written yet. they got a pledge to a vote on expanding or continuing in some form the increased premiums for premium support payments for Obamacare. I think they're likely in the Senate to win that vote. I think there's enough Republicans who are worried about the political consequences of being held responsible, as I think Democrats have positioned them to be held responsible for millions of Americans having difficulty affording their health care or dropping it. So if we roll forward and there is some form of enhanced premium support for Obamacare policies, then I think what's currently perceived as a net win for Republicans, I think becomes a net win for Democrats. And right now, I think they're more likely to win on that than not.
So the other big political issue this week is the entire Epstein file saga that kind of continues on in politics, which it's interesting to me because it really makes not a big noticeable difference in anyone's life, but somehow or another it just continues to keep carrying on. And it seems to be a big focus of the Democratic Party, the idea that they're going to force them to open up the file. What was interesting about it today was that Trump took the position, or Donald Trump, President Trump, took the position of supporting the House in the resolution that would call for it to be opened up. How do you see that? I mean, obviously, it seems to me if he wants to open it up, he could just do so. Is this just politics on his behalf and he knows that it'll be voted down in the Senate, or do you think he's actually changing his position on it?
I think he is the proverbial leader saying, "Where are my people? I need to find out where they're going so I can lead them." He was clearly on his way to a fairly substantial defeat on the floor of the House. Whether this is just a stratagem to try to bottle it up in the Senate, but I think the same pressures will come to bear in the Senate. As we've discussed previously, and Paul, I think you agree, I think releasing raw intelligent files from a criminal investigation is a terrible, terrible precedent. But it appears we're going to do one. And I have no idea whether the executive, whether the Department of Justice could simply release these things without an act of Congress making what is supposed to be private public. I don't know. Maybe they have that authority. But I think this has clearly been a blow to Trump's image and reality of having total dominance of the Republican Party. And he is just seeking to reduce the damage to his remaining ability to control events, at least as far as Republicans are concerned, because of it. I confess I don't understand it. I don't understand its political potency, but it's impossible to deny that it exists, and it has overrun Trump and his control of the Republican Party.
Yeah, and my opinion on the report, I've just seen a lot of these investigative type reports over my time in being in office, and it would more than once it would happen that they would, an investigator might walk into a restaurant with someone that they're investigating, someone that they're following, someone they're trying to get information on. And there might be a person in that restaurant who's a business owner or someone of note, and they would write it down. They would write down that the other person was in the restaurant. Now, they would do that because it's important information. That then go back and do the research, and they'd say, there's no connection here whatsoever. But I can tell you in something that is as incendiary as the Epstein issue, if your name gets mentioned in that, you're on fire. It's just that simple. Even though it's not fair, even though it's not right, So theoretically, you want all those notes in the file so that people can look at it and recognize that a thorough investigation took place. But there should be some limits into that coming out. And if you don't do that, sooner or later, investigators are going to be under pressure to not put those types of reports together. And it'll be problematic from a law enforcement standpoint. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go after people who've done something wrong. That's a whole different story. There is a way in a Justice Department that is independent to be able to do that. But instead, Henry, I'll ask this question of you. What we saw this week was the president now directing the group to go after Bill Clinton and other people who were Democratic forces. How do you see that? Do you see that as a? It's obvious to me why he's doing it. It's a smokescreen. It's trying to say, well, look at them over there, and to put the focus in that direction. Maybe it's an ability to try to keep the files secret even longer because they're in an investigation. But I also am concerned about the fairness of that. Give me kind of what your input might be into that.
I think the striking thing about the Epstein case is how it's gone from being a right-wing kind of quasi-conspiracy theory agenda to now being on the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, as ever more people are taking interest in this story, and it's shifted from the right to the left. And it shows how unpredictable these conspiracy theories are, especially, as you note, when you've got raw information coming out in these investigations that no one can really make sense of without the broader context, without additional investigative work being done. And so I agree with Bob that the Epstein episode in the second Trump administration is actually quite interesting because it may have marked the beginning of the end of this period of kind of untrammeled influence that Trump enjoyed after the election and after his inauguration, where, his government was so powerful. You had Elon Musk running wild in the federal government, firing people and releasing data and all these things, and it seemed like he could do whatever he wanted. And then the Epstein scandal re-emerging, whatever you want to call it, conspiracy re-emerging, really did mark something of a turning point where first the Republicans started to buck the Trump administration and show that they weren't maybe as loyal as he thought they were. And then I think the second major turning point actually came last week with these elections in New York and Virginia and New Jersey, where the Democrats did much better than people expected. And I think this has slowed down the momentum of the Trump administration significantly. And so I think that the Epstein affair coming out again is kind of good timing. It shows you these two things. You can say that the first year, the first phase of the Trump administration may actually have come to a close.
Henry, why do you think, though, here's what amazes me. Like, if you're going to break with President Trump, I could see if you broke with him on Ukraine because you've been a supporter of NATO and our allies. Republicans for a long period of time have been a big supporter of that. I could see where you would break with him saying, hey, the rule of law, you shouldn't be going after your political enemies. That doesn't make sense. I could see where you would go after him on the budget deficit. The conservatives who for a long period of time have been talking about a balanced budget. But the Epstein file is the one that you decide to break with him on? Look,
Good question.
I personally believe the president during his campaign blew that up into being something bigger than it really was. But most insiders know that. Both sides, they both know that it was bigger than that. It's stunning to see me watching the Democrats making this their big play, because I don't think it really is going to help them in an upcoming election at all.
On them the same way it's backfired on Trump. Nobody knows what's in these files. Nobody knows how they're going to be interpreted. They could be interpreted any way. As you two both pointed out, raw intelligence like leaked emails can be interpreted in any way by an audience of amateurs with no background information. It's very dangerous, the whole thing. Maybe this is just something that both parties have to go through to relearn the lesson that these sorts of conspiracy theories should not be indulged because it tends to end badly.
So, Bob, what's your theory on that? Why is it that on the issues on values that I know, I have friends who are in the Republican Party, who are in the House and the Senate, and I know a number of the values that have been promoted by the Trump administration it's the antithesis of what they believe. At a visceral level, they would be opposed to it. And yet the one that they're taking out after him on ends up being this. What's going on with that?
I share your mystery, and I thought you stated it very, very well. Of all the things that causes a break with Trump, why would it be this? I think my best explanation would be because this is one on which the MAGA base it isn't with Trump. They want to see the files released. So you have the traditional Republicans that have been tiptoeing around the edges of dissent with Trump, who now have a safety valve, something safe that they can be in disagreement with Trump on without alienating the MAGA base and putting at risk their own reelection. But what's most interesting to me is that it wasn't those traditional Republicans that caused the breach that Henry described. It was true blue MAGA diehards who signed on to the discharge petition, resisted being hammered by Trump personally and his attorney general and FBI director, did not withdraw their signatures, forced a vote, and you had the most MAGA members of Congress in Arizona, Andy Biggs and Eli Crane, announced that they were going to vote to release the files. So it wasn't so much the people who disagree with Trump on all those other things that caused this break, as Henry described. It was the MAGA forces. And it's because, for reasons I cannot understand, it became a major cause within MAGA land.
Bob, maybe something about it is that it's the elites that are in the files, right? Epstein, for all of his shady background and very unclear origin story, he moved among elites, whether it's the Harvard professors and administrators who were trying to get his money for research projects, or the investment bankers that he worked with and worked for, or the real estate developers like Trump and politicians like Clinton and Prince Andrew, although, as we must now refer to him, the royal previously known as Prince. But, he moved among the elites. And so only elites...
Yeah, you have to explain that to us one day, Henry.
So the elites are implicated in the scandal, right? And the populist movement, the MAGA movement, is anti-elitist. And so this is perfect for them. You can't be any more populist than be calling for the Epstein files, because elites are the ones that are implicated in them, that are going to get damaged by it. Maybe that's what makes it safe for the MAGA base
I think that's
after the Epstein files, because they are populists and they're after the elites. And guess what? Epstein moved among the elites. Whether he was an elite himself, I don't know, but he definitely moved among the elites.
Yeah, I think that's an astute observation. There's little doubt in my mind. The Democrats have their own set of elites. They're billionaires. The MAGA base has their set of elites, and it's more about who you hate as opposed to what are you going to do to help me or to help our country. I also find it interesting. I mean, God bless the Democrats. I thought AOC was going to be their nominee for president. Who knows? It may be Marjorie Taylor Greene by the time they're done. It seems to be moving in that direction. Okay, so let's jump to the affordability question. We had a series of elections in the last couple of weeks. Virginia, New York, California, as well as New Jersey, where Democrats way outperformed in almost every single district, way outperformed what we thought they would. That's been credited in large part to the affordability issue, the fact that people are struggling on the affordability issue, or they're struggling being able to buy things, inflation costs that seem to be rising up to them. And so all of the politicians began kind of talking about that as being the issue. And Trump, recognizing that, or at least believing that that's why it was that they won, has begun kind of trying to counter that. I was shocked this week to see that he actually admitted to the idea that tariffs may be causing food prices to go up. And he admitted to that by saying we're going to take the tariffs back off of food, which, congratulations, I think that's what he should have done. But here's what's interesting to me. I watched Joe Biden do this, and then I watched Trump do it, which is to try to explain away why it's not a problem. Now, I want to start with this. If you look at disposable income, I think the number is somewhere around $63,000 per person in terms of per capita disposable income. And if you look at it on a national basis, it's a massive number. In fact, it's one of the largest numbers ever. So there's a good argument that the public is doing fairly well. Now that's offset by inflationary issues, the cost of products, what's taking place with the savings being diminished. But the point is, there is somewhat of a fair argument saying that we're doing much better than you might imagine that we were by watching the election. But that dog isn't hunting. There's just no doubt that Joe Biden wasn't able to pull it off, and it seems to me that Trump isn't able to pull it off. Give me your thought on that, Henry, in terms of where we are on that issue and why that doesn't actually work.
The affordability issue. It is striking to see Donald Trump having basically won the election against Biden, I think, to a large extent because of the affordability issue, to now basically also be trying to avoid it, to dodge it, to say that it isn't happening, that people aren't feeling price pressure at the supermarket, etc. I think it's remarkable to see this happening and how out of touch politicians can be, actually. And looking at data, maybe it seems like things are affordable, but they're not. As someone who goes to the supermarket every week, sometimes you stand in front of the products in the supermarket and you kind of can't believe what you're seeing. And I saw an article recently in the newspaper that confirmed my suspicion, which is that the price of coffee is just absolutely ridiculous. I paid $14 for a pound of coffee, ground coffee, the other day in the supermarket. Thought I was going crazy, and then luckily I saw in the newspaper that the price of coffee is up 50% since the start of the year, just since the start of the year. And so some of these prices, there's obviously a lot of unevenness across different products, but some of the prices are getting to levels that we've never seen before and that seem, to be honest, kind of ridiculous. So I don't know how Trump thinks he can get away with this, trying to tell people, don't believe me, don't believe your own eyes. I don't think that it's going to work out for him. And it's also opening the door, right, to different people with different policy prescriptions. I think we'll talk about Mamdani and others later, to try and combat price inflation in ways that probably aren't going to work either, right? So it's not working out well for consumers and voters either, because there's not been a real application of people's brains, politicians' brains, to actually solving this problem.
Bob, your thought on that? Why is it that their challenge with trying to make the case of what's going right with the economy? Is it just that they're wrong, or is it just that the pressures that are happening to the consumer are larger than ever? How do you see that breakdown in terms of affordability? Is it a real issue?
Well, I think it's natural when you're the guy in charge to say things are going well. So I think it's the natural instinct of the Biden administration to say the economy is doing well. And Trump now says we have the greatest economy in American history. But the reality is that inflation remains a significant force that gives people the perception, and in some cases the reality, of an erosion in their living standards. And then that was compounded by Trump's tariffs. The 50% increase that Henry mentioned happens to be precisely the tariff rate that he imposed on Brazil, which is the source of much of American coffee. And the increase in prices for groceries have exceeded the increase in wages. The reality is that under Biden, real wage increases tended to be slightly ahead of the increase in the cost of living, but that wasn't reassuring to people who were paying more for groceries and everything else. There was a perception that their standard of living was eroding because the buck that they did earn didn't go as far as it used to. Under Trump, there's more of a reality, particularly on the lower end of the income scale, where real wage growth is now lagging the increase in the cost of living, both a function of persistent and stubborn inflation and compounded by Trump's tariffs. So for a important part of the American public, the most vulnerable part, the reality now matches the perception. Their standard of living is being eroded.
Yeah,
What
and on
you
the
have to
three
remember
big ones.
also is that
Sorry, Henry.
you have to remember also for so long we had almost no inflation in the United States. I mean, from probably before the Great Recession or around the time of the Great Recession until the pandemic, there was very little inflation in the United States. Definitely, probably maybe 1 or 2% a year. And for most people, the price of things just didn't change. So the magnitude of price changes we're seeing completely dwarfs anything in anyone's lived experience, as some people like to say, right? It's something they've never seen before. And it's quite shocking, probably, to a lot of people who have never seen it before. So it's not just about the magnitude of the changes or how they match how much their wages are changing. It's simply the rapid onset of this inflation in a way that had never happened before for 10 or 15 years and has really caught people by surprise, and they can't quite come to terms with it.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting. It probably would have worked for Trump to have been able to blame Biden policies had he not done the tariffs and the big, beautiful bill. It seems to me that, especially the tariffs, just wrung that issue around his neck. Do you see it the same way, Henry?
Yeah, I think it's almost like Biden naming this enormous spending bill the Inflation Reduction Act, which just became like a national joke. I don't know why the Democrats ever thought they could get away with that, by the way. I drove past a project with a sign on the way back up from Tucson on Sunday morning, and it said paid for by the Inflation Reduction Act, and I was kind of astounded that they would even allow it to be printed on anything in public anymore. Such a mark of shame for the Biden administration that they ever attempted that. But yes, I mean, if Trump had wanted to keep flogging the Biden administration for their economic policies for a couple of years to give himself a free pass for a while, he could have done it. But he wouldn't have been able to upend the tariff system that led to 10,000 headlines and YouTube videos and TikTok videos such that everyone in the world now knows that Trump put all these tariffs in place, and tariffs tend to lead to inflation. No one was going to let him away with that. So in both cases, Paul, very puzzling behavior, quite self-destructive, and in the end, the consumer is paying the price, quite literally.
Yeah, Bob, we've seen 587 changes to tariff policies in the last 6 months. And that's not an exaggeration. You would think I was kidding. That I looked that up right before the show. 587 changes.
So it could be 588 by now, Paul.
Could be way over 600. But what's fascinating to me about that is it seems to me that that's put the label on his forehead for being responsible for the inflationary changes. Even though, some of it's housing, some of it's healthcare. Food is certainly a big part of it. Food, I think, is very affected by the tariffs, housing to a lesser degree. But nonetheless, he seems to be the one that is owning it today. Is that how you see it as well?
Politically, absolutely. I think he took responsibility for the price of goods when he went crazy on the tariffs. And he continues to go crazy on the tariffs, changing them incessantly. But if you look at the larger factors that drive the standard of living, he's also bad on those. He is an easy money guy. He's not a guy that is saying the Fed needs to put a priority on bringing inflation down to at least its 2% target. In fact, he's exactly the opposite. He's arguing for even easier money, which is inflationary. On fiscal policy, his reconciliation bill calls for enduring deficits in the $1.5 to $2 trillion area. So he supports fiscal policy that creates inflationary pressures, and he supports monetary policy that basically monetizes those huge deficits in a way that makes inflation having its durability that we're seeing today. So even beyond the political effect that tariffs have of having him own the issue, he shares co-ownership with the issue with the Biden administration and Democrats. In reality today, we do not have a stable dollar political party. We don't have a fiscal discipline, balanced budget, get down the debt party. We don't have a free trade party in this country. So if you look at the things that generate persistent erosion in the standard of living, neither political party is in favor of the things that might actually do something about it. And both of them are in favor of the things that have caused it.
All right. So you wrote a great Substack article on this, and I will put that up on our site. I'll refer people back to it because I think it's definitely worth reading. But while we're here, let's just kind of stick with this point that you also made in the article. You made the point that it was fiscal policy, monetary policy, and then productivity, that those were really the three areas that you could gain control over inflationary problems. So start, if you would, by just, for people who don't understand it, explaining what the difference is between monetary policy and fiscal policy, and how you believe, again, summarize, if you would, how you believe the Trump administration, we'll come back to the Democrats in a moment, which you were also critical of on these three issues, but talk about your criticism of the Trump administration on those two topics.
Monetary refers to the control of the money supply, which under our system of government has been vouchsafed to the Federal Reserve by an act of Congress. And it primarily tries to influence the money supply and inflation by the interest rates that it sets, which are what banks mostly pay to each other to borrow from each other, or what the Fed charges banks to borrow from itself. And when inflation spiked, it got to 7 to 9%, depending upon which inflation index you use. The Fed increased interest rates to try to bring it down. And it did bring it down, but it now seems stuck between 2.5% to 3%. And it's been that way for a long time. The Fed sets a target of a 2% inflation rate. And we have exceeded that rate for 5 consecutive years. And we don't appear to be approaching it. If anything, it seems to be stuck where it is. Now, Donald Trump has jawboned the Fed consistently, his first term and his second term, to reduce the interest rates that they charge, which is to disarm the primary mechanism that the Fed uses to try to bring inflation under control. Fiscal policy refers to what Congress enacts in its annual budget. And when we have large deficits, as we have consistently for several years now, the federal government, the Treasury, has to go out and borrow that money. That has a negative economic effect in any event because it crowds out and makes more expensive private sector borrowing because the federal government is competing for that pool of capital. It becomes inflationary when the Fed, in essence, decides to monetize it by purchasing that debt, which increases the money supply, which is inflationary. And since the Biden administration's variety of big spending bills, they had 3 of them, moved our borrowing rate to close to $2 trillion a year. The Fed engaged in what, for reasons I don't fully understand, in the technocratic circles is called quantitative easing, which basically means they bought in the secondary market. So the Treasury would sell the debt, and then the Fed would go into the secondary market and buy nearly all of the increased debt that resulted from those big spending bills that was enacted during the Biden administration. So that it takes the inflationary pressure and makes it inflation. And that's the story of the last 5 years. Trump is offering no break from that. The deficits under his reconciliation bill are as high as they were under the Biden after the Biden administration's big spending blowouts, and he consistently wails about the need for the Fed to reduce interest rates even further and faster. He has, in fact, called for a Fed rate of 1%. When the Fed was trying to fight inflation, they got it up to about 5.5%. It's now down to 4%. If they adopted Trump's policy of 1%, we would see the value of the dollar just disintegrate. And the ability of the federal government to borrow probably constrict to the point where I think we might be offering debt that no one would buy.
All right, Henry, part of what Bob's talking about that I find to be interesting is Trump's appointment to the Federal Reserve. Stephen Moran wrote a paper on the whole idea of the dollar being way overvalued. I think Stephen Moran's point is not only is the dollar overvalued, that we ought to be trying to make it worth less. Now, since Trump appointed him to be, I don't know, kind of an ex officio member of the Federal Reserve, he's kind of sitting on the side while still being in Trump's office. He's been advocating consistently for lower rates. How do you see what Bob is talking about, both in terms of fiscal policy as well as monetary policy?
Well, the reason why a lot of Trump supporters want a cheaper US dollar is at least partly because they want to see a revival of US manufacturing. And they think that Chinese manufactured goods are so cheap because the Chinese government artificially lowers its currency, makes its currency cheaper so that Chinese goods are cheaper. Now, there's some truth to the second half of that. The Chinese government maintains a fixed peg on its currency at what is probably an artificially low rate. But that's a completely different story as to whether you can devalue the US dollar in a strategic way to benefit the manufacturing sector. I think personally that it's not a smart strategy. I think that the dangers of inflation far outweigh the prospective benefits of trying to rebuild the manufacturing sector, which is a very, very difficult task and perhaps a completely impossible task, actually. At the end of the day, US manufacturing employment has been declining since probably the late 50s or the 60s in total terms, even as the amount that the US generates in terms of manufactured goods increases because each person generates many, many more goods with automation and more efficient factories, etc. So I think that trying to boost the US domestic manufacturing industry by trying to lower the price of the US dollar abroad is a fool's errand, actually. I think that's very, very dangerous because it undermines the stability of the dollar, which can cause inflation, which has these huge negative effects on consumers that politicians are being punished for right now. And the potential payoff in terms of manufacturing jobs is very small and very unlikely that it would ever arise.
it also means less investment capital is going to want to come into the United States. So it has a negative impact on investment. So Bob, you also talked about productivity. And again, let's just focus on the Trump administration. We're going to come to Democrats right after this. But in terms of productivity, I know a big portion of that's driven by regulations. Do you see the Trump administration as being more of a net positive on that side or more of a net negative?
Kind of a push. It certainly isn't pursuing the kind of regulatory agenda that the Biden administration did and the Obama administration as well. And Trump in his first term was highly deregulatory. And I think there was great benefit economically to his approach to regulation from his first term. He is not he's not pursuing universal regulations, but he is pursuing a form of crony capitalism that I think is destructive of productivity. You begin with his tariffs, which create uncertainty, has frozen investment to a very large extent, and investment is what drives, in significant part, improvements in productivity. In addition, he has sort of taken the position that if the federal government's going to grant licenses or other benefits to large corporations, the federal government should get part of the action. And he's taken equity in a variety of firms. His Commerce Secretary has reflected the possibility of when the U.S. government grants a patent, which is a constitutional obligation, responsibility, that maybe the U.S. government ought to get a share of the return of the proceeds from that. He told computer chip companies, if you're going to sell to China, he didn't take equity positions in them. He says if you're going to sell chips to China, the federal government gets a share of that. Well, I think the combination between the tariffs creating uncertainty about the investment climate and crony capitalism creating questions about what is it going to cost you in order to get a necessary government approval has had a chilling effect similar to more aggressive universal regulation as pursued by the Biden administration and the Obama administration. So I think it's kind of a push. If he got rid of the tariffs, there might be a net benefit. But the effect of the tariffs and the uncertainty of the tariffs, the erraticism of the tariffs on investment, I think has a very chilling effect on the ability to create the kind of productivity growth that would lower the cost of goods relative to wages.
All right. So Democrats won on this issue without talking about any of this detail, obviously. They won on this issue of affordability. We ended up having Abigail Spansberger, who was successful in Virginia. We had certainly, what's her name? Mickey Sherrill, who was successful in New Jersey. And then we had also the mayor of New York, who ended up being successful as well as a social democrat. If you would, for a moment, do you think that the Democrats' real agenda, not the agenda of what they're able to do politically, or maybe separate how they may find success on this issue politically, but at the same time, whether or not you see there's any possibility of success in any of the things that they're promoting from an agenda standpoint to actually reduce costs?
Politically, I think it is a potentially highly successful stratagem. It gives the Democrats something that resonates with people, that isn't their woke agenda, that did so much to alienate swing voters. And one of my theses about American politics and from Ronald Reagan on is that it's usually enough just to be the other guy when swing voters are dissatisfied with the status quo, and they are chronically dissatisfied with the status quo. Their swing voters are constantly toggling between the two parties based upon dissatisfaction, primarily with whoever occupies the White House. So politically, I think it was a successful strategy in this off election, and is likely to be a very successful strategy in 2026. Substantively, there's not much to the agendas that have come out so far. Democrats haven't changed their tune on the big three things that actually have an effect on the general level of general price level. Instead, what they're identifying are specific individual cost items that may have some political resonance. Healthcare was one that was common to all three of those successful Democratic candidates. But if you look at their healthcare agendas, it's to demonize benefit managers and to suggest that they're going to do something to eliminate the ability of benefit managers to drive up the cost of pharmaceuticals. And in one case, I think it was in New Jersey, actually have a state agency take their place. And on groceries, the one that I found most mystifying and sort of best illustrating the vacuity of all of these agendas was Cheryl's grocery agenda. The first item was we're going to go after the large corporations that are increasing prices so much, without any description of what that meant. I mean, how do you go after the large corporations? Then the entire rest of the agenda were incentives, subsidies for smaller grocery stores and locally produced food. And there may be huge benefits from smaller grocers and locally produced food, but lower grocery prices isn't one of them. That comes from the economies of scale that the large corporations that she wants to go after provide. And it was for all three of them. It was that it was subsidizing particular goods that are sensitive and demonizing large corporations, but except for housing, all three of them did call for trying to reduce the paperwork and red tape that inhibits new housing construction. And I think there's some sincerity among Democrats to seeing that as a problem that needs to be addressed. Except for that, I think it was just political window dressing, but highly successful political window dressing.
Yeah, first on the housing issue, I think Ezra Klein has had an impact with his book, Abundance. The abundance agenda on at least as it relates to housing. I think there is a little bit of traction going on the left. Now, I would say it's going on the left for people running for governor. It hasn't filtered through yet to people running for the city council, which is where most of those regulations actually exist and need to find a different effect. I also would say, Henry, that I was very impressed with the backgrounds and the records of the two women. Certainly, Abigail Spansberger, she was an intelligence officer. She had been in Congress. She framed herself as more of a moderate. And then Mickey Sherrill had gone to the Naval Academy. She was a pilot of a helicopter, which they played off in her ads. And again, they tried to play her off as a moderate. They're trying to play her off as being different than Mom Dami in New York. But what I also found to be interesting in really reading through their detailed positions, my sense of it is that there is a huge void in the Democratic Party on real public policy anymore. There's no real discussion about what we really need to do to be successful. And I think that's partly because they're trapped by their own interests. As an example, I would just tell you to bet on this. If Democrats end up winning the presidency in 2028, they're just going to extend Trump's tariffs. If Trump doesn't get rid of them, I'll be shocked if Democrats do, because effectively they play to those interests who tend to like tariffs, namely organized labor. Organized labor has tended to be appreciative of tariffs, at least certainly during the time that I was in office, that's true. So they end up going to these things like what Bob mentioned a moment ago. Well, we're going to go after those grocers because gosh knows they're making a 3% profit, and that's just ridiculous. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. How do you see that from the Democratic standpoint?
I have a lot of sympathy for the Democrats in a way because they're just one of so many parties of the center left around the world that can't really find their way at the moment. The British Labour Party is in the same position right now. They just a year ago won this landslide election with a very small share of the vote, but they still had a big majority in Parliament. Now they're completely adrift. They are having to backtrack parts of their tax policy before they even release it. The German Social Democrats reduced to around 15 or 20% of the vote. They're the junior party in a coalition with the Conservatives and have no idea what they're doing. I could go on and on, right? The contemporary left has no ideas. The best ideas that are coming out of the contemporary left are, on the one hand, ideas coming from people like Jeremy Corbyn and Mamdani. When I say best, I mean most popular. And those are old ideas, I mean. Bash on big corporations, price controls, more government intervention in the food sector, etc. It's really old stuff. I don't think anyone really believes that that's going to do any good. And then you've also got a few sort of rehashed, like free market economic ideas coming in, like the abundance agenda, right? Which is a little strange. It doesn't really gel with the left at all because it really is about deregulation. And that's not something that the left has ever been that comfortable, right? Letting free markets run wild. I don't think that that's going to really resonate with the left, with their core voters on the left as well. So I think that the global left, and not just the Democrats, but many of them, are really adrift. And core planks of their agenda for the last 10 years, especially environmentalism and climate change, combating climate change, and now there's stuff that's known as the wokeism, affirmative action and related policies. They really haven't worked. They haven't created a large constituency. They haven't proven very popular with voters. And so it's natural that there's a sense of disillusionment, that there's a casting around for ideas, old ideas from the radical left, some ideas from the 80s that might sound good for a while, and it might be really kind of novel to young leftists to hear the idea of free markets and deregulation. But really they're at a dead end at this point. And it could take quite a while before the Democratic Party finds its way. And in the meantime, it could just, as you say, just be a populist party like the Republicans. They could just become populists, they could become protectionists, and they could bash on big business instead of bashing on immigrants. We might just be in a destructive phase before something else comes along. But the Democrats are not alone in being completely without any good ideas at this point.
Yeah, and what I see as being a big difference between now and the 1980s with Bill Clinton, or 1990s, I guess I should say, with Bill Clinton, was in the 1990s, Bill Clinton actually had a group of people who, before he was elected, that were talking about centrist Democratic policies. And some of those policies included things like free trades and free market. I don't think he was standing up and advocating for them in a massive way during the campaign, because I was involved in the campaign against him in the primary. I was working with Paul Tsongas at the time. But after he got elected, he actually began to put some of those concepts into play: free markets, free trade, as well as issues of balancing the budget. He talked about the era of big government is over. Right. I don't see any real thought going into moderation today. It's all headlines. It's superfluous stuff. Like we're going to go after the grocers, or we're going to We're going to put into place more regulations and stop these billionaires from becoming the oligarchy that screws us over. It really is, for the most part, if there's any real thought going into it, it seems to me to be more remnant of Marxist type theories that are about class warfare. Thoughts, Henry?
To give them some credit, again, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was this kind of wave of public policy reform that started with Thatcher and Reagan and spread to all over the world about deregulation, free trade, low taxes. People call it neoliberalism. And essentially what politicians like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and many others around the world did, even as leftists, was they basically said, this is a toolkit that we can use. We're going to do it in a different way. To the conservatives, we're not going to attack the welfare state in the same way. We're going to be more compassionate, or, try and use it in a way, or market it at least in a way, to lower income voters rather than as a more elitist project and being as anti-labor union with it. But it was a toolkit that they could use, and it was a positive agenda that had been worked and tried out. There's not such a thing at the moment. It's not like what Trump is doing and the Brexit agenda, or what they're proposing in France, from the National Front, or what Orban is doing in Hungary. It's not like the agenda of the global right today has a great record of economic dynamism, of wealth creation, that the left would be appealed to try and take those parts. There's nothing like that sitting out there on the shelf as a package of public policies that the left would want to adopt. I don't think they see anything appealing in the agenda of the contemporary right, the way that people like Clinton and Tony Blair, after a long time, were prepared to say, we can take some of these things from people like Reagan. It took a lot for them to be able to do that, for Blair to be able to take things from Thatcher, Clinton to be able to take things from Reagan, but they could eventually. I don't think there's anything out there in the ether or just sitting on the shelf as a set of policy proposals that is really going to help that the left finds appealing at this point.
So, Bob, in your column, one of the things that you said was that you hope that Mamdani actually would have the opportunity or ability to implement some of these things. Tell me where you were coming from on that one. I found that interesting.
Well, I thought that a domestic example of the failure of socialism would be more impactful than the multitude of foreign examples of the failures of socialism that are abundant, but don't appear to be as impactful as they should be in terms of the domestic political discussion in the United States. So there is a part of me that would kind of like to see rent control and free buses and free daycare and government grocery stores get set up in New York. I would pledge not to visit the city during that period. But I think after a period of seeing government-run and government-owned grocery stores, that people's affection for their local grocer, as large of a corporation it might be strengthened. So that was significantly tongue-in-cheek. But
I like it, Bob. I can't wait to see that in the Sex Pistols cover band playing not anarchy in the UK, but communism in the USA. It's going to be great. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Well, here's what I see with Mamdani. I'm 100% positive the grocery stores won't work unless they just give away the groceries for free, which that's possible. I mean, they could subsidize the price of the groceries. Unless they subsidize the price of the groceries, it's not going to work. I mean, I look at places in the Middle East that were once known as like bread baskets for creating wheat, right up until the point that they decided that the government should be the one making the bread. And then they failed. I watched it in our government. In fact, I was involved in some things that I thought maybe government could play a broader, more expansive role. And I just found through experimentation, it doesn't work. The interests that you have to go out and comply with make it impossible. All of a sudden, your labor force can vote for you. All of a sudden, the competition that might not like what you're doing, they can vote for or against you. There's There are just some things that government shouldn't be doing. I'm also convinced if you do things like saying, hey, we're going to make bus rides free, I'll make you a guarantee. I promise you this is going to happen. It'll become the place that the homeless go for air conditioning and heating. They'll be riding the buses. And the woman who wants to go to actually work on the bus won't take it. So the people that you should be trying to help, all of a sudden, they're not being helped. It won't work. It's ineffective. And so to me, the logic of letting them try it, I'd love for them to experiment on it in New York so we can talk about it for the next 30 years about how it failed and utilize that as an experiment for local governments. I think there's some advantage to what Trump's doing on tariffs. Since the 1930s, everybody had been saying, gosh, tariffs caused the last Great Depression and it was problematic and it was inflationary. We forgot those lessons. We just did. We forgot the value of not having tariffs and having a free market. Trump's trying them. And I think what we're seeing is there's even some admission on his behalf. They're not really working. Not if you want to keep food prices low. If that's what matters to you, or beef prices low, they're not effective. So that experimentation, I think there is, while I wouldn't have done it, it's not something I would advocate for. I think it's a bad idea. Like if I were going to advocate to New York for anything, here's what I would tell Mom Dummy. Hey, see those big rats out on your street? Why don't you try picking up your garbage? Like that's something a mayor could do that would be really effective at making your city more livable. But that's okay. Go give them a free grocery store and let the rats kind of roam free, which is exactly what they'll end up doing. People who need to get to work won't be taking the buses. Don't worry about them because productivity is not going to matter in your community anymore anyway by the time you get rid of all the rich people who you're going to now tax into oblivion. But in any event, so if we can, let's go to, I'm going to get my free advice from my political corner, my political consultant corner. And here's the free advice. You know that I'm doing the Arizona Independent Party, and we believe that the extremes in both parties are problematic. On these issues, especially as it relates to the issue of affordability, what's the position that you would tell us or advise us that maybe we could take that would be more successful, not only politically, but also more successful if we were actually to get into office and to be able to have an effect on the economy? And I'll start with you, Bob, on that.
Well, there's really not that much that a state can do to affect general price levels. And I think it's a mistake to pretend that you can. There are things that the state can do to improve productivity in the private sector. Arizona has a relatively low individual and corporate income tax rate. We have generous deductions for manufacturing. We have a light touch regulatory environment, at least at the state level. And that is part of the Ducey inheritance that Hobbes really hasn't moved to alter. We haven't had a more aggressive state government regulatory environment as a result of having a Democratic governor. It's virtually impossible for the legislature to enact tax increases because, according to our state constitution, that requires a 2/3 vote. So making sure that one recognizes the importance of those things and a willingness to preserve them is, I think, the best that a state candidate can do. It would be great at the national level if we had someone arguing for a sound dollar, a more disciplined federal budget, and light touch, but universal regulatory environment. So if a third party candidate really wanted to do sort of a Ross Perot, but do it right, I think that's a right agenda that's been abandoned completely by the two major parties.
Henry, advice or input?
I totally agree with Bob. It's really hard for state government to move the needle on a lot of these issues. I'd say there's one issue that we haven't talked about on the show that you maybe could at least make some inroads in, which is actually energy, because state energy policy can make a difference. We have big energy public service companies here, APS in particular, and SRP that runs the hydroelectric system. But especially APS, you could make a pitch to put pressure on APS to try and build out the energy supply, because the energy demand in the state, and especially in the Phoenix metro area with the data centers that are being built, is surging. They have to increase their energy supply by a tremendous amount. And so I think a major pitch you could make to consumers, to voters, would be around energy affordability and promoting energy supply at all costs, because I don't think that a lot of consumers really understand how tremendous the increase in demand for energy is going to be if all of these data centers get built, and how that could have a big impact on their monthly costs if we do not build out enough gas power plants in the state.
Housing is another specific issue on which advances could be made in terms of affordability. There were enough Democrat votes in favor of a sharp deregulation of housing zoning and design requirements from cities. And Governor Hobbs vetoed the bill. So that is support for that kind of significant state action to free up the kind of housing you can build and where you can build it. Could have not only some political resonance, but be a substantive policy advance that would be very important in Arizona. We've lost, particularly in the Phoenix metro area, an edge that we have historically enjoyed in terms of relative housing costs. And it requires pretty dramatic and substantive action to recover that.
All right. So, Bob, I'm going to give you the last comment on this, but I'm going to give you kind of my thought on it and what I've been saying to candidates. And I'd love sharp critique if you have it, or also agreement if you have it. I really am interested in your input. So at the federal level, my comment to people who are looking at running for Congress is focus on the federal deficit. Focus on the idea that we really have a very large deficit, and it's problematic. And it's not just problematic to our government and to our country in terms of how much we're spending. It's problematic to interest rates. It's problematic to what is happening to people on an everyday level. I would also tell them, I'm not certain that big government's really working for us, that maybe there are reasons that we ought to take a look at in a variety of areas in creating a smaller federal government. Now, I'm still a supporter, and I think our group should be, of human rights and civil rights and equal rights. But I'm just not certain that, for the most part, that the federal government is the place where most of that enforcement should be taking place. I think a lot of these discussions at a state level ends up providing for a better democracy. At a state level, I would focus first and foremost on the idea, and maybe this is at the federal level as well, that we need to include more people. We have to get independents included in this process. As they've been falling out of the two parties, their voices aren't being counted in the primaries, and we have to find a way to engage that public in both sets of elections. Now, I've been a supporter of open primaries, but it's important that we find a way to focus on that change. Secondarily, it's the economy, and the economy has a variety of different pieces to it. The state budget. State budget, I think, has challenges. You and I have talked about that in our past. I believe that's a big issue. Water, we're 5 million acre feet short of water in Arizona. That's going to play an important role. Energy utilization, housing. The idea of trying to deregulate will help us from a housing standpoint to be able to lower costs, take the housing regulations that exist mostly on a local level and bring pressure to bear on them so that it becomes more affordable to build housing. And that's a space that we've been involved with. We've done a show here where I pointed out that the cost on housing on a $400,000 home can be as high as $100,000. Now, you may not be able to get rid of all those costs, but you could make a big dent into it. But what we shouldn't try to do is to emulate the other two groups. The other two groups The single biggest problem that they have is that they demonize one another. They believe that the single biggest problem that exists is that the other side, the other party exists. My own personal opinion is there are benefits that both parties can bring, and we should be able to draw those out of them. But we also need a moderating voice, a mainstream voice that helps ensure the general public that the issues that they care about are being moved forward. Affordability is important, but we're not going to get to affordability simply by saying, let's go build more affordable housing with government subsidies. It makes up 1 or 2% of the total housing stock today. If you spent a massive amount of money, maybe you could get it up to 3%, but it's not enough to make a real difference. We have to engage the private sector. If we can't engage the private sector on building additional water plants, on ensuring that we build affordable housing, on building the right types of energy supply, we're not going to be successful. And a respect for how capital markets and the free market works becomes important at both the federal level and the state level. I'll give you last word on it. Hopefully you'll give us some input and advice on that, and criticism if you see that that's important.
No, I think all those points are very important and valid, both substantively and politically. But that gets to what I think is an overarching issue. I think that there is a broad scale belief among the electorate, which includes large segments of Democrats and Republicans, in addition to independents, that our politics are broken and that we aren't being able to govern, that partisanship has paralyzed our ability to have a government that works, and the need for pragmatic problem solvers to have a chance to get to positions of leadership. And I think that is sort of the overarching issue. And I think not demonizing your opponent is part of it. You have both parties saying idiotic things about each other that I think the average voter just shakes their head and says, how can we expect anything to get done if these are the people who are making the decisions? And I think we've had a recent, very, very useful illustration of that inability to govern and to function. Our state budget is in a serious world of hurt. I've been delving more deeply in it for a column that I'm working on. And our ability to continue existing programs is in large part dependent upon getting a federal grant under the reconciliation bill for reimbursement for immigration-related costs. Now, you would think that if it's that important, you would get our Democratic governor and our Republican legislature to work together to have a common application to get that money. Well, that's not what we have. Democrat Governor Katie Hobbs has submitted an application for that money, and the Republican leadership of the legislature have submitted a separate and different request for exactly the same money. Now, it all works out to they both are asking for about the same amount of money. But we have two applications, not one. I think that is a very illustrative example of what's broken about our politics, that you can't even get bipartisanship on making that application when basically you're asking for the same amount of money. We
had 2 big years of surpluses. What happened to those?
They got spent immediately. We have had a period of time in which even after the income tax reductions that were adopted, we've had plenty of money to continue existing programs and even do some expansions, such as the ESA program or the efforts to make water augmentation or increase daycare subsidies. But the money has been squandered by pork barrel spending. And I'll, in the next column, kind of illustrate that. So I was really kind of shocked when I developed it. We've generated far more than inflation and population growth in revenue growth since 2019, which is the kind of the last normal year that you can use as a base. And we've accumulated gigantic surpluses, as much as $2.5 billion on about a $17 billion budget. And it's been squandered all in the next fiscal year. And we've done that 2 or 3 times. So it's been gross mismanagement. And I think you can also lay that on our politics being broken. There's just no ability, given a Democratic governor and Republican legislature, to say, hey, let's look forward 3 to 5 years and let's husband this money and make sure that we can continue the existing programs and we can make these critical additions rather than a $15 million subsidy to the Prescott Rodeo. We just don't have, under our current politics, the ability to have that sort of pragmatic sense of what we need to do on a going forward basis.
The one thing I found that is a real benefit of government is it doesn't matter how much money you give them, they actually will find a way to spend it. It's amazing.
Yeah, and if they would have just spent it over 2 to 3 years rather than all in the very next year, we would be okay. Instead, we're in a serious world of hurt.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right, Bob, thanks for being on. We appreciate your input today.
You bet. Good to be with you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.